Why is Japan finally done with tourists? Japan is building walls, not at its borders, but in front of its most iconic views and on its oldest streets. On paper, Japan just hit a $54 billion jackpot, 39 million visitors in a single year, making tourism their second largest export after automobiles. But as a sociologist, I've looked at the data. This isn't a success story, it's a crisis for the people who live there. Japan's tourism boom has weaponized itself against its own people, turning one of the world's most welcoming cultures into a country of no entry signs and black mesh barriers. And when people say Japan has always had huge tourism, they're wrong. What we're seeing now is unprecedented, faster growth than the 2010s boom. I'm John and I study East Asian societies. And in the next few minutes, we're going to walk through the 4 hidden forces, the invisible operating system running beneath the surface that turned this dream destination into a national crisis, and why the pattern we're seeing in Japan is about to go global.
A phenomenon known as over-tourism, and it's causing problems across Japan.
In the 1980s and 1990s, Japan averaged 2 to 3 million visitors annually, and most of that was business travel. Domestic tourism was the real powerhouse, Japanese people traveling within Japan. Foreign tourism wasn't a priority. Then came the 2010 surge. Japan went from 6.2 million visitors in 2011 to 31.9 million in 2019. That's a 5 times increase in 8 years, driven by visa relaxation, a weakening yen, and aggressive government marketing campaigns. By global standards, that growth was already extreme. But COVID created a whiplash effect that made everything worse. In 2021, Japan recorded just 246,000 visitors, a 99% collapse from the 2019 peak. Businesses that had retooled for tourism shut down, hotels closed, tour operators went bankrupt. When Japan reopened its borders in October 2022, the infrastructure to absorb tourists was on life support.
Japan's finally lifting travel restrictions for the first time since the start of the pandemic, and here at the Daniel K. Inouye International Airport, many travelers can't wait.
Then revenge tourism hit. Pent-up demand from the lockdowns created a tsunami. In 2023, Japan recorded over 25 million visitors, over a 6.5 times increase from 2022. By November 2025, they'd already hit 39 million, on track to surpass 40 million for the year. That's about a third of Japan's entire population flowing through in a single year. That's faster growth than the 2010s boom, and it's hitting a country that isn't ready for this many people. And here's something that makes this even messier. Japan isn't just dealing with tourists, it's dealing with a record 2.57 million foreign residents. And the backlash is bleeding together. On the street, a local can't tell whether the person blocking the temple path is a tourist staying 3 days or a foreign worker who lives down the block. The frustration of over-tourism and the anxiety over immigration are fusing into one reaction, and it's driven by visibility. I unpack the immigration side in depth in another video, but for this one, we're focused on the tourism trap. The 2010 surge was rapid, but it happened over nearly a decade. Businesses had time to adapt. Infrastructure expanded gradually. The post-COVID surge compressed that same growth into 3 years. Now add geography. Because 70% of Japan is uninhabitable mountains, tourists are forced into a tiny footprint, with 73% of all stays crammed into just 5 cities: Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Sapporo, and Fukuoka. That concentration is what creates the perception of crisis. Take Kyoto. The city has 1.5 million residents, but hosts over 50 million annual visitors when you combine domestic and international tourists. That's a 33-to-1 ratio. To make that feel real, imagine 33 strangers standing in your front yard every single day, all year long. Now imagine trying to get to your car, walk your dog, or just sit on your porch in peace. That's what living in Kyoto feels like. Walk through attractions like Gion or Fushimi Inari, and it's wall-to-wall crowds. Residents can't move through their own neighborhoods. Public transit is overwhelmed. The city doesn't feel like theirs anymore. Here's where the government's narrative conflicts with reality. Officials point to one metric to justify continued growth. Japan has just 0.2 tourists per capita. That's 1 tourist for every 5 residents. Compare that to France at 1.5, Spain at 1.8, or Greece at 3.4. By this measure, Japan has plenty of room. But that number is a bit of a trick. It counts tourists across the whole country, even in places where no one visits. In reality, tourists crowd into the same few cities and the same famous photo spots. The math says Japan has plenty of room, But the people living in Kyoto feels like they're being squeezed out. So we've established that the growth is unprecedented and geographically concentrated. But that doesn't explain why 2024 and 2025 hit harder than 2019. So let's talk about money. Quick plug, if you like these sorts of cultural deep dives, don't forget to subscribe. On July 3rd, 2024, the Japanese yen hit 161.62 against the US dollar, the lowest exchange rate since 1987. That's a 37-year low. Since December 2019, the yen had depreciated 44% against the dollar. For American tourists, that meant 47% more buying power in Japan, practically overnight. The Big Mac test makes this real. A Big Mac in Tokyo became about half the price for Americans compared to buying one at home. Hotels that cost $200 a night in 2019 were suddenly $110. A $50 dinner became $27. It looked like the perfect travel hack. Fly to Japan, live like royalty for cheap. But here's what that hack meant for locals. The same Big Mac that tourists saw as a bargain now costs Japanese workers more of their paycheck than it did before. Japan went from expensive destination to discount vacation in a span of a few years, but only if you weren't Japanese. It was driven by interest rate policy. In March 2022, the US Federal Reserve started raising rates to combat inflation, eventually pushing them above 5%. Meanwhile, Japan's central bank maintained a negative interest rate of minus 0.1% until March 2024. Because of that difference, investors moved their money out of Japan and into the US. The yen crashed as a result. A weak yen makes Japan attractive to foreign tourists, but it makes everything more expensive for Japanese residents. Imports cost more. Food, energy, raw materials. Inflation hits locals while tourists pay less. Japanese people can't afford to travel abroad anymore because their currency buys less. And they can't even afford domestic travel because hotels and attractions have raised prices to match what foreign tourists are willing to pay. Soon, the government will build a different kind of barrier, a financial wall designed to price out the very tourists the currency collapse attracted. More on that later. But the weak yen only provided the financial incentive. Soft power gave people a reason to book the flight. The global anime and manga market is valued at over $50 billion in 2024. It's projected to nearly double by the early 2030s. Streaming platforms like Netflix and Crunchyroll made thousands of anime titles available worldwide. Then COVID lockdowns hit in 2020, creating a captive global audience that discovered anime en masse. Bangers like Demon Slayer, Attack on Titan, and Jujutsu Kaisen went nuts those few years. That surge created a new genre of tourism, anime pilgrimage. Fans started visiting real places they saw in their favorite shows. Take a simple train crossing in Kamakura. It's just a normal street corner, there's nothing special about it, except for one famous scene in an old anime called Slam Dunk. And it's not that old because I watched it growing up. Okay, I guess that's old. Now thousands of tourists, mostly from East Asia, stand in the middle of a busy road trying to get a picture posing like Sakuragi Hanamichi as the train passes, forcing the town to hire security guards just to keep people out of traffic. Residents who lived there for decades now have to navigate around security barriers and crowds of strangers just to get to work. A quiet neighborhood crossing became a daily traffic hazard because of a 30-year-old anime. The Japanese government saw the opportunity and leaned in. Super Nintendo World opened in Osaka in 2021. Life-size Gundams were erected in Tokyo and Yokohama, which is every East Asian man's fantasy, including mine. Pokemon centers expanded across the country. The government began officially promoting an anime and manga tie-ins as part of its tourism strategy. Then Japan reopened its borders. Timing was catastrophic. Pent-up demand from the lockdowns, a historic low yen, and peak global interest in anime and manga all collided at once. Look at the 2024 visitor numbers for South Korea, China, Taiwan, and the US. Every major source surged simultaneously. But here's where it gets sensitive. China's 188% surge made Chinese tourists the most visible group. And historical Sino-Japanese tensions amplifies complaints about poor tourist behavior. I'll talk about Chinese tourists in an upcoming video, so subscribe and click the bell to get notified when it drops. American and Western tourists brought their own friction. Think camera behavior, talking loudly in quiet temples, messing with the Shinto shrine water basin, turning heritage sites into IG backdrops. The content-first mindset clashed with a culture where the most important rules are never written down. Japan is a high-context culture. In Japan, if you're looking for a sign that says, "Don't do that," you've already missed the point.
No, stop! Just calm down. Don't do it.
There's one invisible boundary that causes about 90% of the conflict in places like Gion. If you don't know it, you're probably already crossing it without realizing it. It's called kuki wo yomu, literally reading the air. Here's a simple explanation. If you're on a train in Japan and everyone around you is silent, the air says you should be silent too. No one will tell you to be quiet. There's no sign saying no talking. You're just supposed to notice and adjust. That's reading the air. Most tourists weren't trying to be rude, they just didn't know that they were supposed to read the room, not the signs. And the Japanese are notorious among Asians to say one thing and think another.
In Japan, when we say, "Oh, hi,
Oh, hey.
you guys look like have a very, very fun time."
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, pretty fun. Thank you.
What we mean, "Oh, hi.
Hi, hey.
Hey, you guys too noisy, super annoying.
Oh.
Shut up."
When tourists failed to do it in places like Gion, the consequences became unbearable for locals. We'll see exactly how that played out in a minute. But it's one thing to visit a location for cheap from an anime, it's another thing to live there. And as the demand for authentic stays grew, the neighborhoods themselves began to change. That's where the housing crisis begins, because tourists don't just visit, they displace. Before 2018, Airbnb listings in Japan exploded to around 62,000 properties. Most of them were illegal, operating without proper licenses, pulling residential housing off the market and converting it into short-term tourist accommodations. The Japanese government saw the problem and cracked down. On June 15, 2018, they enforced the Minpaku law, which required all short-term rental operators to register and follow strict regulations. The result? Airbnb listings plummeted to about 13,000, an 80% drop. That sounds like a policy success, but it was too late. Peer-reviewed research on Osaka showed thousands of residential units had already been removed. And after the crackdown, those apartments didn't return to locals. They stayed locked in the tourist economy as hotels or vacant investments waiting for the next opportunity. This is what sociologists call tourist gentrification. It follows a predictable cycle. First, a neighborhood becomes a tourist destination. That creates demand for accommodation. Hotels get built, but short-term rentals are more profitable, so landlords start converting apartments. Housing prices rise because there's less supply for residents. Long-term residents get priced out and leave. Traditional businesses that served locals close because there aren't enough locals left, like the local bookstore on Shijodori that had been there for decades, or the authentic hair ornament shop that served geisha and maiko, both replaced by convenience stores. Tourist-serving businesses such as souvenir shops, chain restaurants, convenience stores replaced them. The neighborhood transforms into something unrecognizable. Kyoto's historical center is the textbook case. Between 2015 and 2019, house prices in the old city increased 55%. That's a speculative surge driven by tourism. And the population decline accelerated. Before the regulation, Kyoto was losing about 365 residents annually from the city center. After the regulation, that number tripled to 1,073 residents per year. Tokyo's Asakusa district shows how fast this can happen. Asakusa is home to Sensoji Temple, one of the most Instagram famous sites in Japan. In 2025, land prices in Asakusa increased by 27.4%, the highest increase in all of Tokyo. Families who lived there for generations can't afford property taxes anymore. They're being pushed out by investors who see discount real estate. As a result, Japanese tourists are avoiding Kyoto entirely. The city has lost 7 million Japanese domestic visitors annually since its 2015 peak. They can't get hotel rooms because international tourists book them months in advance. Prices are inflated. The crowds are unbearable. Kyoto has become a place Japanese people avoid. Now here's a contradiction. The Japanese government allocated over 15.8 billion yen, about 105 million USD, for emergency measures preventing and mitigating over-tourism. That sounds like they're taking the problem seriously. So what are they actually doing with that money? They're rolling out AI-based parking reservation systems to reduce congestion around popular sites. They're funding marketing campaigns to push tourists toward lesser-known regional areas, places like Tottori, Shimane, and Tokushima, that don't hit anyone's Instagram feed. They're investing in infrastructure upgrades at overwhelmed tourist spots. And they're proposing to triple the international departure tax from 1,000 yen to 3,000 yen. about 20 US dollars, to generate more funding for these measures. These are tactical fixes. Japan is trying to redistribute the flow, smooth out the bottlenecks, and extract more revenue from the visitors already coming. But here's the problem. At the same time, the government is doubling down, targeting 60 million annual visitors by 2030, a massive 50% surge that ignores the crisis already happening on the streets right now. And the government is banking on one specific group to hit that target: Chinese tourists. Why? Two reasons. Proximity. China is really close, making repeat visits easy. Second, spending power. Chinese tourists spend more per capita than many other nationalities. But here's the tension. That same group is currently at the center of the most intense local backlash. We'll see how that plays out in a moment. Japanese domestic travel is down nearly a tenth compared to the 2019 baseline, and fewer than 1 in 5 young Japanese people between ages 20 and 34 hold passports. Compare that to the US, where 2 in 5 people have passports, the UK at 3 in 4, or Canada at 3 in 5. Japanese people aren't traveling internationally because they can't afford it, and they're not traveling domestically because their own cities have been transformed into tourist zones. The government is trapped. We can't reduce tourism without collapsing regional economies that are built around foreign visitors. But they also can't ignore residents who are being displaced, priced out, and watching their communities disappear. When the government's fixes failed to stop the tide, the frustration moved from the policy offices to the streets. The residents took matters into their own hands. In May 2018, a new term entered Japanese public discourse: kankou kogai, tourism pollution. 2022, surveys in Kyoto showed that roughly 4 in 5 of the residents complained about public transport and streets being overfilled with tourists. But here's what made the backlash inevitable. During COVID, residents got relief. The crowds disappeared, the noise stopped. They could walk through their own neighborhoods again. They remembered what their cities used to feel like. When tourists flooded back in 2024 and 25, in even greater numbers with an even weaker yen, making everything cheaper for visitors, the contrast was unbearable. On May 29, 2024, Kyoto's Gion district put up no entry signs on private streets and instituted a 10,000 yen fine, about 67 US dollars, for anyone who ignored them. The city had to act because tourists were grabbing geisha and tearing their expensive clothes just to get a photo. One tourist even put a cigarette butt into a geisha's collar.
Some tourists have been throwing cigarette butts into geishas' necks. One geisha had her kimono torn off by a tourist.
Now, context matters here. Before World War II, Japan had roughly 80,000 geisha across the country. Today, Kyoto's 5 geisha districts have about 250. That's near total erasure. They're the last 250 women keeping a centuries-old tradition alive against impossible odds. When a tourist harasses them, they're vandalizing one of the last remaining fragments of a fading culture. Locals call these aggressive tourists the Michael paparazzi, and the harassment was constant every single day. That's why the response by locals feels so severe. Isokazu Ota from the Gion South Side District Council said it plainly: "We don't want to do this, but we're desperate. Kyoto is not a theme park. When communities literally erase their most iconic sites from view because the human cost of managing tourists becomes unbearable." Gion's barriers weren't an isolated response. That same month, the town of Fujikawa Guchiko erected a massive black mesh barrier, 2.5 meters high, 20 meters wide, blocking the view of Mount Fuji from a Lawson convenience store. The spot had become Instagram famous, creating traffic hazards, trespassing, and trash everywhere. Physical barriers were one response, but other cities chose financial walls instead. Remember that financial wall I mentioned earlier? This is it. In March 2026, Kyoto will implement a hotel tax that can only be described as punitive. The current tax is $1,000 per night, about $670 US. The new tax for top-tier hotels will be 10,000 yen per night. That's a 10 times increase. The stated goal is to shift from quantity tourism to quality tourism. Translation: they want fewer budget-conscious travelers who see Japan as a discount vacation, and more cultured spenders who respect the culture's norms and fragility. Now think about who stands out. Foreigners are much easier to notice. They stand out, especially when they get off big buses in huge groups. Because they are so easy to see, they are the first ones people get angry at when they've had enough. Some public transit posters started appearing with imagery that sparked international controversy. Monkeys representing loud behavior, or graphics that seemed to target specific subcultures, like breakdancing. This is what happens when two cultural systems crash into each other. Symbols that read as innocent in one culture trigger offense in another. But this scapegoating isn't just xenophobia. It's a predictable response when a system is locked into a path it can't escape. When the economy becomes dependent on tourism but residents bear the costs, they lash out at the most obvious symbols of that dependency, the tourists themselves.
Don't smoke. It's not private. Sorry, what you? What sorry?
I beg your pardon.
But
I did not know.
It's
Don't yell!
The government can't reduce tourism without economic collapse, so residents redirect frustration towards individuals rather than the system. It's a classic pattern when change seems impossible. Nationality-based complaints followed predictable patterns. Chinese tourists have been mentioned the most. They're the fastest growing and the most visible segment.
もう書いてええわ。もう書いてええから帰ってください。もうそんなんいいですわ。あんな汚い食べ方してね。もうそんなんもうないですわ。もうむちゃくちゃですわ。
Tour group behavior and different cultural norms around public space created friction. American and Western tourists drew complaints about phone behavior, loud talking, and treating heritage sites like content opportunities. In Shirakawa-go, a village with 500 residents that hosts 2 million visitors annually, a 4,000-to-1 ratio, nearly 3 in 5 of the residents expressed negative impressions specifically of overseas tourists, not domestic ones. That distinction matters. It reveals that the issue isn't tourism itself, it's the concentration, the behavior mismatch, the feeling of being overrun by people who don't understand the place they're visiting. Over 3 out of 5 of Japanese people now support two-tier pricing, making tourists pay more than locals. It's a sign that residents don't feel like welcoming guests anymore. The old rules of being a good host are breaking down. And there's a sociological explanation that explains exactly why. Japan isn't the first, certainly won't be the last to go through this. Barcelona saw anti-tourism protests in 2024, locals spraying tourists with water guns. Venice tried charging a €5 entry fee and got 7,000 more tourists who came for the novelty. Amsterdam banned new hotels and cut Airbnb listings by 80%. You see this pattern repeat everywhere because the pressures are global. In 1983, 2 sociologists came up with a big idea called institutional theory. It's simple. When countries feel pressure, they all start acting the same way. They call this isomorphism, which is just a fancy word for copying each other. It's like a global game of follow the leader, where everyone ends up making the same mistakes. 3 pressures forced Japan into this situation. First, coercive pressure. They were forced by their struggling economy. After the collapse in the 90s, Japan needed a new way to make money fast. Tourism was the only option. Second, mimetic pressure. They copied other countries. Spain's tourism miracle showed them how. 30 million visitors in 1975 became 80+ million in 2019, with tourism generating 12% of GDP. Third, normative pressures. Shared standards being created. Global organizations told Japan that more tourists is always good. The UN World Tourism Organization set growth targets. Global tourism consultants sold best practices that prioritized visitors' numbers and GDP over local affordability. When all 3 pressures align, they're pushed into it. Now Japan is stuck. They've spent billions of dollars building hotels and training workers. Whole towns now rely on tourists just to survive. If the tourists stop coming, those hotels still need to pay back their loans, but they won't have any money coming in. Japan has gone too far to turn back now. The government is trying to fix the problem while also trying to bring in 20 million more people. They are walking a tightrope. It's a dangerous balancing act. They have to keep big businesses happy while also listening to the angry locals who live there. If they fail, they might lose their jobs. They have stepped onto the tightrope and now there's no way off. Remember those walls Japan built? They're a sign of sadness. Sadness for neighborhoods that don't feel like home anymore. Sadness for a country caught in a trap it can't escape. If you're planning to visit Japan, consider Kukin Woyomu, reading the air. Watch how locals move through a space and match their energy. The quieter you are in the temple, the more you notice. The less you rush, the more of a neighborhood reveals itself. You start to see the Japan that's closing off to everyone else. We can't fix the structural trap the government created, but we can travel in a way that opens doors instead of closing them. Japan rewards people who looks closer. When we stop trying to capture it and start trying to connect with it, the barriers start to disappear. But here's the paradox. To hit 60 million visitors by 2030, the government is banking on the very demographic currently at the center of the backlash, Chinese tourists. That tension is a whole other layer I'll unpack in my next video, so click subscribe and hit the bell if you don't want to miss it.